Hi, hello everybody. So thank you all for coming to my talk today. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about what I and other people at Twig have been doing for more than a year in the context of task and data workflows. And I'd like to present to you today the approach that we came at, which is a general framework for making composable task and data workflows. So exposing tools to both engineers, software engineers, data scientists, and data engineers in order to implement workflows and to provide them in a robust and reproducible way. So where do we come from? Twig is a company, it's a French company that's been existing for about 8 years now. We do consultancy on functional programming projects, various aspects of it, general development, infrastructure as code, data engineering projects. We have no preferred project scope. We've been having projects ranging from a few weeks to a few years. My last project, for instance, has been going on for 3 years, and no specific domain. We can go work on projects ranging from bioinformatics to the financial sector. And as for me, well, as Lila said, I'm a Haskell developer and a data engineer, and I've been working mostly during my PhD and then after at Twig on bioinformatics projects. So I'd like to start this presentation by giving you I think it's just a quick categorization of what we mean by workflow tools, because this is something that might be a little obscure or a bit fuzzy when we don't know exactly the terms, because some are not exactly super well defined. So I don't have the pretension of defining any terms right now. I just want to be clear what I will be talking about. So first, I would like to make the distinction between what I would call a task workflow and a data pipeline. To me, a task workflow is a direct acyclic graph of tasks, and the point of them is that they are eagerly executed. So one task completely terminates before the next one starts. So it's in a way similar to the way build systems work. In order to build a target, you have some intermediary targets, and they all need to be completely evaluated, completely computed before we can go to the next target. And we have some level of parallelism, which is possible, but only when two tasks are independent, meaning when they're not directly connected in a graph. So tools we have like that in the domain of data science would be Luigi and Airflow, for instance. And what I mean by a data pipeline is something more similar to Apache Beam or Storm. It's also a DAG, also a graph of, but this time of data processors. And it's more similar for the people knowing lazy evaluation in functional programming. It's more similar to lazy function processing lists. And in that case, all processors may run in parallel, because when one processor yields new data, then it can continue to output new data when the downstream processor is processing the data it just output. The second difference I like to make is between tools targeting fine-grained tasks, so where each node is just one elementary operation. For instance, in TensorFlow, each node can be as simple as one mathematical operation, and workflow tools that target coarse-grained tasks, where each node is a script or a Docker container running a script, like, again, Luigi and Airflow do. The third way to categorize workflow tools is more known. It's the distinction between static graphs, where the whole set of tasks and their links has to be known in advance. And if you have something like conditional branches, for instance, if this task yields some number, then go to that task, or else go to that other task, then all the possible branches must be known also in advance. And that was the case in TensorFlow before version 2, and this is, I believe, also the case for Luigi and Airflow. And the other class would be workflow tools working with dynamic graphs, where the computing, as the processing goes, it may add new nodes to the compute graph. And this is, for instance, the way PyTorch or Apache Spark work. And the final categorization, which I haven't found much mention of, is between workflows that only target what I would call the process time, which is when the actual logic of your application runs, and what I would call the configuration time. So the distinction I make between both is both happen at the runtime of your program, so everything has been compiled or everything has been interpreted. But at config time, you may perform some configuration, like, for instance, choosing which data sources and sinks you will target choosing which HTTP endpoints, which databases. You may perform some ahead of time checks this way, so checking the network is reachable if all the resources are in place. You may perform some graph rewriting in order to do optimizations. And if you have a scheduler that works through static scheduling, it will operate that way. And of course, this possibility to exploit your graph at config time requires you to have some prior knowledge, not only about the graph, but also about the computation. So it requires you to be able to deeply introspect each task of your graph. So after this categorization, I will present the scope of the work we've been doing. So our contribution is some approach, which we call Commental, which we've been, for which we've published a paper at the Haskell Symposium a bit earlier this year. So it's an approach that's usable to implement both task workflows and data workflows at any level of granularity, and which can exploit also prior knowledge, but we are although restricted to static graphs only. And the application domain to which we've been applying this technique is simulation and data analytics applications, for instance, in pharmacology with Pfizer, or in biochemistry with the client I'm working with currently, which is a small French company called Nova Discovery, and who deals in simulating biochemical reactions in the human body. So I'd like to throw at you some buzzwords about what our tool is, how our tool is doing stuff. Like, it's making stuff reproducible, like in the sense that you can run twice the same pipeline and get twice the same results. It's driven by some strong focus to homogeneity, which means that a task and a combination of tasks and a full workflow, which is just a big combination of tasks, are all the same type. You've got one type that identifies all these concepts. So it favors composability too. So gluing two tasks together will yield you a new task of the same type. It favors configurability, meaning that tasks are not tied to one specific environment, so not tied to one specific file system, to one specific database or everything. So we keep the logic of the task abstract from the I/O. It favors reusability, meaning that tasks can be imported, defined in modules, reused in many projects. And it favors separation of concerns, meaning that the developer's world and the analyst or the data scientist world are kept separated. So to sum it up, we strive to make the tasks to be usable just like plain old function. And how did we do that? Well, by combining two different domains of pure functional programming named abstract effects and arrows. So first, talking about effects. Effects are something that give you control over what the tasks can do. So here I have, for instance, 3 examples of tasks you might find in regular data science pipelines, like training a model, classifying some data, or simulating a system of equations, which is closer to what I do with my client currently. So each one of these tasks will need to perform some effects. So effect is really, well, it's up to the developer. It's up to the one who models the domain of expertise to define what an effect is. At its broadest sense, the word effect can be anything that runs I/O. And this is the way it works usually in Haskell. People who know Haskell know that you have the distinction between I/O code and the pure code. But a code that is flagged as I/O can do basically anything. It can write to file, it can reach some web server, it can write in some database, it can do anything that is just not purely computing a value. So for instance, when you define the effects that these tasks want to do, for instance, for training a model, you might say that, well, you have one effect of downloading a data set, but you can refine it further as to saying that I want to download a data set from a specific source. So downloading a data set from one S3 bucket, for instance, might be a different effect than now downloading it from another S3 bucket. So you have full control over the granularity of what your effects allow the people who use them to do. You will want to log stuff and you will want to write some results. And the same would go for classifying data or simulating or any kind of scientific computing. So you can, for instance, here notice that the logging stuff is present all the time. So if these 3 tasks are being used in the same pipeline, well, ideally, we would like to configure the logging feature, the logging effect, just once and for all. We would like the 3 tasks to be sharing the same logging system, to be sharing the same effect. And same goes for downloading data sets. For instance, you would want, if the same pipeline trains a model and then classifies data, you would want the 2 tasks to use the same kind of effect when they download data sets. It would be configured the same way, and it would allow the same permissions. It would provide the same features to the data scientist. And the benefits of having so finely controlled effects are, well, we can remove with a huge class of problems. For instance, when pipeline that can do opaque arbitrary I/O, well, that can't exist anymore. A pipeline that's sort of merge some execution logic, which should not be, strictly speaking, related to the logic of the pipeline when it's gone to. Task writing to file system, they shouldn't be, it's gone to. So it's it's sort of pushing further the advantages that we already have with static typing, is that more errors that before were happening during the execution become compilation errors. And even for the errors which we can't really express as types, because the way to make stuff become compilation errors, for instance, in Haskell or similar languages, is to encode more information in the types. Even when it's complicated or cumbersome to encode this information in types, you still gain what we call early failure, because your task will be inspectable at config time. So remember that by config time, I meant what happens before the actual logic of a pipeline runs. So this gives you early failure. And all of these features promotes reproducibility. So reproducibility is not something you get for free, but it's something that can be facilitated by the tools you use. So let's delve into some code now. What do we mean by abstract effects? So here I call them binary. We'll see later why this binary term. So what I mean by an effect is something that has an API and several possible implementations. So it's super similar in this in the grand scheme of things. It's super similar to an interface or an abstract class. And the API of each effect will be expressed as a Haskell data structure with two type parameters. And this is why we call them binary, because each effect has two type parameters. And in the jargon, the implementation or one implementation for an effect is called a handler or an interpretation function. So here in my block of code, I have two simple effects. One that is just doing some logging. So here are my two type parameters. The first one refers to the input of the effect. The second one refers to the output. So here I have one data constructor. So this is something that can be created in my code or pattern matched in my code. And I'm saying, because this is a GADT, a generalized abstract data type, a feature of Haskell or Camel and Scala, in which you can say, well, if you use that constructor, you will get this type. So the type of the input that is expected by my log effect and the type of the output that is returned by it is directly encoded here in the type. So I'm saying just that this is my interface. When you trigger a log effect, well, you have to feed it a text that will be written, and it will give you nothing because there is no interesting result. And this bracket type, which we call unit in Haskell, is the way to represent just non-interesting results. It's a type that just has one possible value. And another effect would be file IO. So same, two type parameters, A for input, B for output. And I have defined two constructors, read and write. So this time we have a special parameter here, which is the file path of the file we want to read. I'm saying file path, but it can be a URL or anything. And this file path is not, strictly speaking, part of the input of the effect for reasons we will see later. The input of read is nothing. And when you want to read some file, it gives you a text. And the input of write is just exactly the reverse. So now that we have abstract effects, they're just abstract representations, some data types that can be shown, that can be serialized, anything you want, you might want to actually execute them. And this is where the interpretation function on handlers come into play. So you will have a new type, which also has these two type parameters, which we call core, and which it actually allows us to perform some work. So here people knowing Haskell can recognize the IO stuff. So it means that this function can do basically whatever you want. So if you have an A to IOB function, it means this function receives an A and can compute anything it wants and return a B. So it can do some work, it can do any work, and because it's not constrained, it's actually not the type we want to expose to our users. The type we will expose to our users are these ones, like the effects, the abstract effects we have. And once we have all this, we can write our basic interpretation functions. So we'll say that log of something is just transforming that effect to just the regular print string function. And file IO transforms a read into the function that will actually read the file, and write into the function that will actually write the file. So it's pretty straightforward. Let me just check the Discord. No questions yet. Okay, if you happen to have questions, in the meantime, don't hesitate to ask them on the Discord. So very trivial effects indeed. Let's see a less trivial one. So in a similar way, I'm having a classify effect. So classify is I want to, to classify some array of data, some vector of doubles, by using some model, some pre-trained models. So here, about the same, actually, it's the same pattern than when I want to read files. I'm just saying that I have some model name, which is pre-trained. It may correspond to some resource on the TensorFlow Hub or PyTorch Hub or any other source where you can download some pre-trained models from. And this effect will receive the data as an input, and it will give you some flag, some integer corresponding to some class as an output. And the interpretation function is also slightly straightforward. So here we need to do a bit more than just one function. We're using the model name first to download the model, and then we're using that model to classify it. So just pseudocode stuff. But here we see that we have something that might be improved, like because our interpreter here does everything at process time. It means every time in our pipeline, the classify effect will be triggered. Every time we want to classify something by using some model, we will re-download the model every time. So what if I want to know in advance the model that will be used? And for instance, check whether it exists so that I can give early failure in the case the model does not exist before anything runs. What if I want to do this download model operation at config time? And what if I want to do it just once if the same model is being used several times throughout my pipeline? So it gives you the same advantage than caching, but on top of that, it gives you the advantage that you don't have to wait until the first classification is triggered by your pipeline to give an error if the model doesn't exist. So it encompasses what caching can do in that case, but it can do a bit more in terms of early failure. So we have effects. What I'd like to show you now is the other parts of the work, the one that's talking about how you chain effects together, how you weave actually tasks into a pipeline. So to keep things a bit abstract first, I would just say that I have some type T, which represent a task, or my full workflow, because I remember I mentioned before that the same type represent tasks or a combination of tasks. And this task also has some input X and some output Y. And let's say I have three tasks. Task 1A, which takes some A in input and returns some B. Task 1B, which takes the same type A and returns a B prime. And task 2, which takes a pair of B and B prime and returns a C. So from the types, you can imagine that you will want to glue this task together in the following graph. So pretty straightforward. And what arrows do, if your type T is an instance of arrow, if it implements the arrow control structure, is to provide you with two operators, other stuff too, but mainly you have these two operators, one that allows you to do parallel composition. So for instance, this composes together task 1A and task 1B into something that will return a pair of their outputs, and sequential composition. So if I have this new task, I can just sequence it into task 2. And full workflow here is just the equivalent in code of this graph that I have here. And for more big workflow, it can become very cumbersome to express all the combinations by using these operators. And there is a more syntax available, more convenient syntax available, which is called the arrow notation in Haskell. And I will show you an example of that a bit later. So we have effects that have two type parameters. We have arrows which have two type parameters. So maybe there is a link between them. Maybe there is something we can do to link both worlds. This link is what we call triggering an effect. So in our framework, triggering is just converting an effect into a task. It's just taking some abstract effect we have and converting it into a type T. And this way, we can then trigger some effect. Here we just read some file and write its output into the log. So we use the operator we saw before. So we trigger an effect, we get this result, we get the effects result, and then we feed that result into another effect. So as a summary, you start with effects. When you trigger effects, you get tasks. By using the arrow operators, you combine tasks into workflow. And once you have a workflow, which internally contains a lot of effects, you use the interpretation functions to transform all your effects and your workflow into some core type. And the core type can do I/O, it can do anything it wants. But of course, the user, the data scientist, or the modeler, or the people who are not developers will only see that part. They won't see that part, the interpretation and the core type. This is left to the developers to choose how to implement them. So the remaining question we have is, well, for now, I've been keeping this type T abstract. So what should this type T, which represents both tasks and workflow, be? So this is where our main proposal is. So the way we represent tasks is by using a new type, which we call rope. And rope basically works through dependency injection. So here you see a rope is internally just a function that will transform a set of handlers into our core type. So it would also be parameterized a rope by A and B, because remember, every task needs to have a parameter for input and another B parameter for output. But internally, this function can trigger some effects. And in order to know how to interpret these effects, well, we just give it the list of the full collection of all the effects. And see, this is why it works through dependency injection. We give the rope to execute it. We just give it the set of the interpreters that it needs. So some terminology. So here, what we call the mantle is just a type level collection of all the effects. And we give a name to each one of the effects. So effects are not only determined by the type, the types that we described before. Yeah, for instance, log or file IO, we also give a name. So it's also a type level name. So it's our symbols which are known at compile time, which means that you can have twice the same effect. For instance, if you want to have 2 logger channels or simulate any kind of multiplexing, you can have several times the same effect, but under a different name. And every time you want to trigger an effect, well, you have to specify the name. The handlers is just the collection of all the interpretation functions. So you have 1 interpretation function per strand. And the core is the target type of all the handler, the one that can do all the IO. And the function that triggers the effect, we call it strand. And here is, for instance, our task echo from before. So we say that we want first to trigger the read effects. And here we gave a name to the strands of file IO effects that we want. We will call it file. And then we trigger our log effects, which will just receive the outputs of this first effect. And this is reflected in the type. So here, people who do not know Haskell, this is a set of constraints that are applied to the type. Here, our type is polymorphic. It can work over any type of core, so any type of full concrete type in the end, and it can work over any mantle, but this mantle, it has the constraint that it has to contain some file IO effect under the file's name and some log effect under the log name. And additionally, because we want to be able to use these operators for combining them, this core type also has to be an IO, because the property of rope is that it propagates any kind of control structure, any kind of operators, of gluing operators that are provided by the core. If a core is an arrow, then our full rope will also be an arrow, and therefore we will be able to use the gluing operators on our tasks. So why is it called a rope? Well, it's called a rope by analogy of something in sports and rock climbing, which is called a Commental rope. It's a rope that is made out of several strands, woven together to make what is called the mantle, which are surrounding a core. So in rock climbing, for instance, the idea of such ropes is that they have a sturdy core and a more flexible mantle. So you gain the best of both worlds. You have at the same time something that is sturdy and also quite flexible. And in our analogy, all the effects will be the strands that get woven into the mantle. So this is where the names come from. The name is coming from. So how could I extract information at config time? This is where this bit that I mentioned before becomes important. When I told you before that when I write some effects, I might want to exclude something from the inputs and just put that as a parameter directly of the constructor. Well, this is because every bit of information that is not included in the inputs, every bit of information that is directly a parameter of the effect can be retrieved at config time. And there are two possible ways to do that. Either you do it in 2 passes. So you write 2 sets of interpretation functions, one that will just extract the metadata from your effect and run nothing, or you can do it in 1 pass. You can change the core so that it can both accumulate the metadata and perform computations. And it turns out that doing 1 pass is actually simpler. So I will go quite fast over that one because I'm not having a lot of time. So here I have a simple task of a simple pipeline of 3 tasks. So I want to read some file, compute some stuff based on what I read on this file, and then write the results in that other file. So I want to be able to gather these file paths in advance. I want to be able to retrieve them, to collect them, and then I want to be able to rebind them, to remap them. I want to be able to treat source.txt as not being a definite path to some place, but just as being some index, some kind of identifier to something I can remap after. So what I want to do that is to be able to change my core into that. Each effect, when it is interpreted, will be, well, the same computation function, but which is parameterized by a new hash map, which is the mapping. So the mapping will describe, for instance, it can be read from a configuration file, and it will say that the ID source.txt is mapped to this actual file path, same for sing.txt. But at the same time, while I'm providing some function, while I'm interpreting my effect into some function that will actually perform the computation, I want also to provide the list of IDs that are used by my function. So, for instance, if I want now to combine 2 call with pass, then it's simply chaining these two functions and concatenating together these two lists. But the question that we can now ask ourselves is, can this type call with pass still be an arrow? Because it's quite a different type from before. It still contains some idea of this computation, but it has some extra metadata. And it turns out that yes, for reasons that involve a slight Haskell black magic, which I will be glossing over right now because I'm lacking a bit of time, but that allows me to just jump to the example I had for you. So this is an example that is publicly available on GitHub. We use here pre-trained PyTorch models to classify pictures. So here is the workflow as some data scientists might work. It's very simple. It's just to showcase what you can do with that. So first we want to read some, so we're using the arrow notation here. So instead of using the explicitly the gluing operators, we can read stuff in a more imperative way, but that amounts to exactly the same. So we have two effects, which one get picture effect, which just reads some picture from some place, which is very similar to the read file we had before. And we have a predict effect. So first we will want to read some data, some input data in the form of a JPEG image from somewhere. Note that we don't specify where it should be read from. This will completely be up to the handler. And then we want to run some prediction on this image. We want to classify it using some model. So we have this model named Inception v3, and we trigger the prediction effect by saying that this model should be retrieved from PyTorch hub under some collection of models named Vision at some version. And then we want to predict using this random classification based on the exact same image, but using another model, which this time doesn't exist. So what we want to have, what the behavior we want to have with that final pipeline is to have early failure. So before we even start the pipeline, before we even start reading anything, we must know that this model does not exist and that it will fail. So internally, the example I will leave the people who are interested to have a look at it. But internally, it calls some Python scripts using SciPy and PyTorch. And the Docker images that are needed are built at config time, and the needed models are downloaded at config time. So if any error should happen at the time of building the Docker image, or at downloading an image, or downloading, sorry, a model, it will happen at config time. So here I run my application. So I made the log so that it separates cleanly what happened at config time. So first, so this is the code exactly. So this is the code that runs. I have just this pipeline, and the rest is just interpreting the pipeline and determining how the effects get interpreted. So the code that you get is really this one. So it doesn't seem from reading that things that happen here will actually be reachable before things that happen here. But actually, all this metadata that is before this kind of arrow, everything that is here in the pipeline is actually reachable before anything starts to run. So you see that first it starts by building some Docker image. So it wants to use PyTorch and it wants to install SciPy on top of it. So I have everything on cache, so it's fast. Then when it's successful, it notices that it will need this model. So it downloads it. It finds it, and then once everything is downloaded and validated, it begins the process time. So it reads my image, and then it writes some classification. And if I now uncomment this rubbish model after rebuilding, well, you can sort of guess what it will do, because I teased that enough during the rest of the presentation, I suppose. But if we just want to wait a bit, stack is a bit slow. I'm on battery, so that's might be okay. So it's starting, and then it's saying that it will need the same model than before, but then this additional rubbish model. It downloads the first, it tries to download the second, but then it fails, and it never reaches the beginning process time line. So everything has been happening before the logic actually starts. So quickly, a conclusion for that. So some features I did not mention. First, we can do what we call reinterpretation of effects, which means we have effect handlers that may themselves trigger other effects. So effects can be abstracted also. So you don't have to, you can share logic between several effects. You can interpret some effects on top of an existing pipeline, that sort of stuff. because the API is completely separated from the implementation, then you have different environments that can just correspond to different set of handlers. So for instance, you could have one way to interpret your effects in tests, like targeting a simple file system, and another way to interpret them in production, targeting actual databases. We can provide caching. So if any task, if the inputs of some task are hashable and its output is serializable, you can just wrap that task in a way that backs it up by a local caching. It integrates quite nicely with common Haskell existing libs and abstraction, and we can use other structures than arrow. For instance, if we want to be able to do conditional branching or feedback loops or that sort of stuff. So the future work that the work that we're doing right now is first heading for the first V1 of Commental, also releasing FunFlow 2, which is a higher level API based on Commental, which is strictly speaking for task workflows. So we have some predefined effects. We have an easier to use an API which doesn't require you to deal a bit too much with effects and that sort of stuff. We need to do some benchmarking because if the overhead is expected to be slight, because we only have some simple types like functions and tuples, we still need to do a bit more benchmarkings. I'm also working currently on how to distribute tasks using a similar hashing scheme than what we have for the caching. And we want to experiment on more flexible frameworks than arrows. So thanks, everyone. My colleagues, Matthias and Doran, will be available at the booth. They will be demoing, for instance, some FunFlow 2 and talking about that if you're interested. And I will be in the spatial room to answer your question. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.